Thank you very much, Karen, for that lovely introduction. Yes, fix my mic. Thanks. Yeah. And for inviting me to speak today. I'm very honored to be asked to come and speak to you. I'd like to personally reiterate your acknowledgement that we're meeting today on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. So hello, everybody. I'm going to talk today about women in power and women in influence and women in Confederation. I'm a stupendous history nerd, thanks to my dear parents who used museums like babysitters and encouraged any kind of history interest or questioning. And when I say used like a babysitter, it kind of went like this, but I went exactly like this actually. I grew up in Montreal and my dad would say, "Do you want to go to the Chateau de Ramsay this afternoon?" He often took me and I would say, "Yes." And he'd say, "Great, make yourself a sandwich." He'd drop me off with instructions not to leave the building and said he would pick me up at 5. So better than dropping me off at the mall, because he knew how entranced I would be and he knew my interest would be engaged the whole time I was there. So, but way to create a history nerd. Thanks, Dad. So both my parents always helped me find out what I wanted to know. My mother was a librarian. Look it up. Which usually revolved around the question, what were the girls doing? What were the women doing? It's often hard to find that out, but it's always worth asking. It's hard because the actions of women were not often recorded in the public sphere and in the public record. So when you're asking those questions, you're looking to private papers such as diaries and letters. I was an adult when I finally made it to Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island to see Anne of Green Gables and to visit Canada's smallest legislature, which is also considered the cradle of Confederation. When I emerged from the PEI Legislative Chamber after the official tour, I saw a painting titled Province House, Ball, 1864. And I said, I didn't know there were any girls there. I said this out loud to no one in particular as I stood in front of the oil painting by Dusan Kadlec of the September 1864 Charlottetown Conference Ball at Province House. The people in this appeared deceptively demure. The usual suspects, John A. Macdonald, Georges Etienne Cartier, George Brown, Charles Tupper, they're all front and center. You can also spot William Pope and Darcy McGee at this big party. But this isn't a situation where they're being blinded by the morning light as they have their photo taken in the long exposure portrait taken outside the Lieutenant Governor's house. Here the men are in tails, and they're dancing beneath the hissing gas chandeliers to music plinked out by the players in the corner of the mezzanine gallery, and their arms were full of women. And such women. A young beauty in white, accented by blue bows at the shoulder and the hem, is framed for dance by John A. Macdonald's arms. A ringleted brunette in a teal gown, with an off-the-shoulder neckline, turns her head to avert Charles Tupper's impertinent stare. Her cheeks doubtless burning. It's a crowded dance floor on a hot, hot night. Even though it's September, it was really hot. Despite the open windows and probably the hint of autumn's scent of fallen leaves carried on a listless breeze, it is sweltering in the high-ceilinged room. Each woman will feel the moisture at the waist of her ball gown, or the seam of a new bodice at least, cinched in as she is by corsetry. And at the back of the neck, ringlets are sticking. A fan at the wrist provides some relief, but just as soon as it's cooled her off a bit, another suitor asks her to dance, and the cycle starts over again. So I asked myself, who were these sweaty, stylish, waltzing women? I had to know. If Charlottetown is the cradle of Confederation, were these the women whose hands did the rocking? There's a version of the Confederation story that most Canadians rarely consider, but it's crucial to understanding the whole narrative of this country's creation. It's the influence exerted by perspiring women hidden coyly behind the ornate fan and under the gossamer silk scarf, sharing intimate details and reaching unspoken understandings over lunch, during dinner, and while sipping punch between quadrilles in the ballroom. This tale wasn't in the newspapers very much. Speculation about who said what in the conference meetings was given way more space, because no reporters covered the event to guarantee candid conversation, and no official minutes were made public. This was at the Charlottetown Conference and the Quebec Conference. This Confederation chronicle lives in other documents, such as letters and diaries written both by men and women. It's these private papers that give us the skinny on what the women were up to and what this nation creation might have looked like to them. For the men, considering a confederation was a fresh thought, and the Dominion of Canada would be the new solution. I believe that this innovative, light bulb on thinking by the fathers was encouraged by hobnobbing with the women. I think of them as the mothers of Confederation, as I've noted. If the women hadn't been so much fun at the parties, would the men have made the deal? I don't think so. If women such as George Brown's wife, Anne Nelson Brown, hadn't provided advice, counsel, and insight when acting as a trusted sounding board, would Canada have happened in such a short amount of time? If the fathers hadn't made the deal, I wouldn't be here. Dusan Kadlec would have made that beautiful painting, and it would never have inspired me to ask, so who are these women? And if you'll stick with me, I'll tell you what I've discovered about the mothers and the wives and the sisters and the daughters-in-law and at least one mistress of Confederation. It's a story of how influence becomes power. It's a great story. It's a real turn on a kaleidoscope through which we can view Canada's creation. I'm going to talk about Canada's conception and its connections to leapfrog, love letters, dinner, dancing, and thousands and thousands and thousands of bottles of champagne. Today I'm going to talk about the women in the lives. I'm going to narrow it down a bit because it's a big topic. I'm going to talk about the women in the lives of the men I think of as the big three fathers: George Brown, Georges Etienne Cartier, and John A. Macdonald. I'll start with Georges Etienne. This is where I did my MA. It's a great school. So Georges Etienne Cartier called affairs of the heart his favorite recreational activity. He was very charming and he was a big flirt. He loved to play the piano and he loved to dance. Oh, he would have been right at home here. Although he was a francophone, he was an Anglophile. He loved all things British. He did not spell the Georges in his name with an S, the French way. He spelled it the English way without the S, more like King George III, after whom he was apparently named. He named one of his daughters after the British monarch, Queen Victoria. The daughter's name was Reine Victoria. And hail fellow well met as he was, he loved the rituals of royalty and of history. He even claimed to be a descendant of the explorer Jacques Cartier. His father's name was Jacques Cartier III, but they weren't related to the explorer, except maybe way back across the pond, but nothing recordable in the New World. Now he had this, Georges Etienne, he had the spiciest love life. Most Canadians know very little about it. He was married to a woman named Hortense Fabre, and it was more of an alliance of powerful families, the same way Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon of Spain to form an alliance. Cartier's wife was the daughter of the powerful Fabre printing family, a family that also had brothers, sons, and nephews in government, in the Catholic Church, and in business. Her father had once been the mayor of Montreal, and Georges had had the temerity to support his opponent. It doesn't sound like Georges Etienne was much of a husband, and it doesn't sound like Madame Cartier was much beyond a dutiful wife. She burned with resentment as she raised their girls to do not much more than marry well, because that was the situation she'd been in the same trap. For what other choice did women have back then? It was marriage, make a good marriage, or join a religious order. Still, they had their daughters and a beautiful home in what we now think of as Old Montreal. It's a magnificent place to visit. It's owned by Parks Canada now. Cartier House, it's one of the best heritage homes we have in the country. The youngest daughter, as I mentioned, named Reine Victoria, unfortunately she died while still a toddler during the cholera epidemic in the 1860s, late 1850s, sorry. So by the 1860s, Cartier was living in a hotel, equidistant between his family home and the home of his mistress. So the hotel is still there. It's called the Hotel Rascal. I think of it as the Hotel Rascal. It's in the Bon Secours Market in Old Montreal. And it's amazing. I love that it's still there. And you can sort of walk the walk between the family home and the mistress's home. So his mistress was a woman named Luce Quevillier. And she was 11 years older than Madame Cartier. And she wasn't exceedingly more beautiful than Madame Cartier. And I only mention this superficial note because the temptations of youth and beauty are often the reasons powerful men give for stepping out on their family life. What Luce did have, thanks to Quebec's separate civil law based on France's Napoleonic Code, was her own money. And her own money allowed her to do as she wished and not give a hoot about what society had to say. She was apparently known to smoke cheroots, little cigars with the ends clipped off, and she wore jodhpurs in public. Unheard of, like big riding trousers. And this was a time when a bustle skirt was considered as daring as a woman could get. She openly traveled and spent lengthy amounts of time with Cartier, a married man. She spent this time with him both privately and quite publicly. It seems the code in the newspaper Society column went like this. If Cartier were at an event with his wife, the story would mention Madame Cartier. If he were there with Luce, no mention was made at all of anyone who might be with him. I like Cartier for living a passionate life, but there are a few things I don't understand still. One is why he alienated his daughters by telling them to emulate his mistress and not their mother. The other is why his foes didn't use his peccadillo against him, and why his lack of loyalty to his marital vows didn't raise suspicions about his political loyalty. The only inference I can make is that it was so common then as it is now that it didn't register on any kind of scandal meter. Yet in the end, it was his mistress who was with him on his deathbed. He died in London in 1873 of Graves' disease. After he died, his wife moved to France after the magnificent state funeral in Montreal. That was quite a story. And she died in Europe, and she's buried in Cannes in France. So Cartier had an unhappy marriage and a mistress. And now Cartier's greatest political ally, John A. Macdonald, he was a different story. He's not well thought of right now for his racist views and actions, but he was a complex individual. He was married twice. His first wife was his cousin, Isabella Clark. Marrying your cousin was something that happened a lot back then, I found in my research. They had a lovely home in Kingston, still there, but she was very sickly. It was probably consumption, the term they used back then to describe tuberculosis. He did love her and they had a son together. Macdonald was devastated by her death in December of 1857. But he had to work. So he left their son Hugh with his mother and his sisters in Kingston while he did his legal and political work. After he came out of mourning, he was considered quite a catch. Many women danced with him, but no one caught him until one woman bumped into him on the street in London in 1866. This was a woman named Agnes Bernard. She was the sister of John A.'s secretary, a man named Hewitt Bernard. Agnes had probably recognized John A. by his gait, by the way he walked, and he seemed to be favoring a shoulder. The story behind the shoulder is really something. Macdonald was said to have been reading when he in bed, and he fell asleep. The candle set fire to his bed curtains. It was lucky that he woke up when the fire burned his shoulder. Cartier was staying in the hotel as well. So was Alexander Galt. Between the three of them, they managed to put the fire out without raising the alarms for the entire hotel. And Macdonald was very seriously burned. It slowed him down quite a bit, but it didn't take him out. And he was out getting some exercise that day, about 10 days after the burn event, and he met Agnes in the street. So Agnes was inching towards spinsterhood by then. She was 31 and Macdonald was 52. They knew each other socially, their families were friends, and they didn't waste any time once the connection was made. They didn't back then. No long engagements. They were married in London 2 days after Valentine's Day in February 1867, while waiting for the British North America Act to be signed, the act that created the Dominion of Canada. Their marriage seemed to be one where each partner was half soulmate, half helpmate, a mixture of affection and practical companionship. It was a relationship of love and respect between adults, although I would say that John's drinking was disrespectful to her, but she found a way to cope with it. They had one child, Mary, a little girl, who was born with hydrocephalus, commonly referred to as water on the brain, and wasn't expected to survive very long, but she did survive and experienced the love of her parents. So even though she could never walk, they were delightfully surprised when she was able to read letters from her father, who called her his dear Baboo. Her parents cared for her at home in an era when it was common to institutionalize children who were considered handicapped and just leave them there. Mary lived to adulthood, cared for by a companion after her mother died, and Mary's buried in London. Agnes outlived John A., and she too is buried in England. A few interesting shared characteristics of the three mothers I'm talking about here is they were all little sisters. Not one of them was the firstborn in her family, and all three left Canada after they were widowed, and all died and are buried in Europe. So my favorite story, love story, is George Brown's. And not just because he's from the same part of Scotland my mother's from. In fact, I didn't like him when I was a little kid doing Canadian history in grade 10, because he was big, tall, dour, mutton chopped Scot, not unlike my grandfather. So, and a little bit mega judgmental, but again, another story. So George Brown met Anne Nelson in Edinburgh when he was back after a big political loss he'd experienced here in Canada. And Anne was the little sister of John Nelson, who had been a school chum when he was at university in Edinburgh. Again, they didn't waste much time. They were courting in the fall, married in December, back in Toronto by January 1863, and parents to a daughter, Maggie, by January 1864. So, and that was when he'd been spent most of 1864. She spent most of it in England after she got pregnant. She went back to Scotland, rather, to be with family while he was traveling. I think it was becoming a husband and a parent that made George Brown capable of becoming a nation builder. He wrote to his wife Anne during the Charlottetown Conference. In fact, their correspondence is the best record we have of the political negotiations. As I noted, no official minutes were kept to be sure the participants would speak freely. George wrote to Anne about the negotiations and the speeches and the social events. I think of them as the love letters that launched Canada. He also wrote to her about how much he missed their baby daughter. And he was a confirmed bachelor. He was well into his 40s by the time they got married. So he wrote, "What a darling little body our Maggie must be. I do so long to see her. I had shown her photograph at Charlottetown to Mrs. Pope, with whom I was staying there, and she coaxed me on Saturday night to show it to the other ladies. They were all perfectly charmed and declared there had never been so beautiful a photograph before. In this, I entirely agree with them." So the place where he was showing baby pictures was that big ball in Charlottetown. And just the idea that one of these guys who had been sitting down all day negotiating the framework for this new country whipped out his wallet and showed them his baby pictures at the big party later. I think it's Canadian anyway. I just love that story. So, and I really believe that this being a father to Maggie made George Brown able to be a father of Confederation. His life with his wife was both passionate and intellectual, and their love grew with their growing family. They had 2 daughters and a son. Their 2 daughters were 2 of the first women to graduate from the University of Toronto. 8 years after their father was assassinated by a disgruntled employee at the newspaper he owned, the Globe. Their mother wanted to go home to Scotland shortly after that tragedy, but the family stayed in Toronto until the girls could finish school. So I love that. I doubt they sat down and say, let's engender a feminist household where you will feel empowered to go to university. But they did. That's what they did, whether they were trying to or not. He had some sisters who were pieces of work too, in a good way. So I'm sure they influenced the girls. So I've drawn a few conclusions after learning about the love lives of the men who created Canada. I think the women in their lives exerted a profound influence on their lives, and consequently, these women were influencers, to use a modern term, in the creation of Canada. The politicians were influenced not just by their wives, but by their mothers and their sisters-in-law, their daughters, and their mistresses. Canada wasn't created by revolution or by war. It was negotiated into existence. It was parlayed into existence. And not just in meeting rooms. In the drawing rooms, that's where most of the deals were made, right at the parties after. Or they were cemented. Any negotiations that had happened over the negotiating table were cemented at the parties. So they did the talking drawing rooms and dining rooms and ballrooms, and it was discussed over drinks and dinner and toasting and dancing. The perfume and rustle of women who were present, I think they softened the hard hearts of some of the men, and at the same time strengthened their resolve to come to an agreement that would offer the most to the largest number of people. So while women in Canada had no real place in public life, even if they couldn't yet vote, they were at the table. They were at the table. And they influenced the men who created Canada to do their very best. Women tend to throw the best parties, and then there they are, as hostesses and chatelaines, looking good and smelling nice, we hope, making sure everybody has a drink and somebody to talk to and a ride home. I believe Canada wouldn't have happened if George Brown hadn't just been married. I think marriage and fathering a baby made him man enough to be a father of Confederation. It changed his attitude, softened him up enough that he stopped fighting with his political opponents, his biggest one being Johnny MacDonald, another Scot, for long enough to consider something bigger. I think the influence of these women can still be felt more than 150 years later. Their influence became political power after women were first elected to Parliament. Agnes MacPhail was the first in 1921. And then in 1929 came the Persons Case, a ruling that led to the famous five, as they're known, to take their case all the way to the Privy Council in London to prove that women were persons enough to be senators. That's why they wouldn't let women sit in the Senate. They were declared not to be persons. So there's Emily Murphy, Henrietta Muir Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, Eileen Parlby. We thank you for sticking with it. And then many years later, Bertha Wilson became the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court in 1982. And then that tightened up the deadlines here. In 1989, Beverly McLaughlin was appointed to the Supreme Court and made Chief Justice in 2000, the first woman to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And today, Chrystia Freeland is Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. These women and others have exerted influence beyond the power they hold. Even if it is troubled, Canada is a great golden gift, and we need to keep it polished with regard for much of our history. We should remember these women, these mothers of Confederation. We should continue to let the lessons of partnership, love, and civil companionship inform and direct our actions in public life. And all that champagne I mentioned? Apparently, the Canadians arrived in Charlottetown with 16,000 bottles of bubbly in the hold of the SS Queen Victoria. And yes, and one historian said that Canada's creation was assured the minute the first cork was popped. I think the effect of women leaders and women exerting influence will continue to help expand civil society. I believe it's time for the Mothers Confederation to be front and center in Canada's creation story. I maintain that if the women hadn't been there, we wouldn't be here. Canada's past is so revealing, particularly viewed through a distaff lens. Not only would acknowledging and considering the lives of those long-gone Mothers of Confederation show us how Canadian social history is not boring, it might help us reframe our expectations of who people are today, particularly the leaders we elect and those people shouldering the role of spouse or partner to our nation's elected and appointed leaders. Lots of people have lots of thoughts on the weaknesses and frailties and cruelties exerted by Canada's Confederation infrastructure. But I believe it's a framework able to withstand all those thoughts and observations and accusations about its weaknesses. I think it's a flexible enough liberal democracy to reframe and reconstitute itself as the society that the framework holds, questions and debates and redefines itself on a regular basis. And I believe considering the influence of the Mothers of Confederation will help us recalibrate our thinking about our country and our beliefs about what is possible for all of us. Thank you.